A friend of mine tried to send you something about, I don't know if you received it, about democracy, and he asked me to ask you.
You mean like right now, or?
No. A few days
Live
ago.
now. We are live now.
Yes, we are.
We start?
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. We are pleased to welcome all of you in our 35th book discussion session. We congratulate all of our viewers of Blessed Eid. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. We are pleased to welcome all of you in our 35th book discussion session. We congratulate all of our viewers of Blessed Eid in advance. Today, we have invited Professor Sabri Çiftçi, who will be talking about his book, Islam, Justice and Democracy. Professor Sabri is a professor of political science and Mikhail W. Suleiman Chair in Arab and Arabic American Studies at Kansas State University. He is also the founding director of Middle East Studies Minor. His research interests include Islam and democracy, legislative politics, Middle East, and Turkish politics. Currently, he is working on two projects about the religious roots of medieval state and the economic determinants of Turkish foreign policy. Çiftçi is the author of Islam, Justice and Democracy, which has been published by Temple University Press in 2021. And he is also a co-author of Beyond Piety and Politics, which was published in 2022 by Indiana University Press. His first book, Parliament in Turkey since 1876, was published in Turkish by Siyasal Kitabavi. He has also widely published in such journals as Comparative Political Studies, Political Research Quarterly, Democratization, International Politics Science Review, and Foreign Policy Analysis, among others. I request Professor Sabri to start his presentation about his book. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, first of all, for this invitation. I am thrilled to be here today to talk about my book, Islam, Justice and Democracy. I'm grateful to Center for International Global Affairs at Istanbul Sabahat Enzim University. And I also would like to thank the participant to be here. I look forward to an engaging discussion. So I would like to start with a general overview. In the meantime, please allow me to also share my screen. Just give me a second here. Just let me know, please, if you when you see my my screen, so that I can make sure that it is.
We can see it.
You can see it now. Okay. So, as I said, I would start with a general overview of the book. Talking about maybe what made me write it, present the methods, introduce some findings, and I would like to focus on two chapters 5 and 6, which rely on archival research and ethnographic research that I conducted in Turkey. If time permits, and if there are some quantitatively minded audience, I would also like to talk on chapter 7, which presents the statistical analysis. And I'm happy to elaborate on more in the Q&A session. So without further ado, let me actually, I just have a quick question, Mehraj, for logistics. What I'm seeing is I'm not seeing my own screen. Would you mind telling me what is the screen that you are viewing before we start?
Only your slides.
Only the slide. Are they in the slide mode?
No.
Slide mode? They're
No.
not. Let me actually, sorry for that. I should have taken care of this earlier, but let me try again. I'm sorry, this is taking a little longer than I thought it would. Just 1 second here. So let's do it again. Okay, so can you see my my slides now?
Yeah, you just have to click on the fourth option below at the corner on the right corner. It will show the slides. Yeah, go right, below. No, completely below the screen. Right side, fourth option after the 4 dots, second option. After the 4 dots, no, below, yeah, right, please. More right. You see towards, yeah, just below, yeah, just below, down.
This one here.
Go left. After the volume. Yes,
Okay,
this one.
there we go. Okay. So you can see it now.
Yes.
Okay. Oh, there we go. So I see. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So, and apologies for that. Okay. So as I mentioned, so I'll be talking about the book's main puzzle, theory, methods, findings, and if time permits, we'll be talking about 3 chapters, but looks like maybe chapter 5 and 6 in detail. So then the question is, why did someone need to write a book on justice and democracy in Islam? First of all, I want to say that the book has been a labor of love. I have studied Islam and democracy for a long time in my career. Usually I was publishing articles, but I wanted to write this book because I wanted to bridge the gap between theoretical and empirical studies. And I wanted to advance the social scientific aspect of the study of Islam and democracy. So the Arab Spring, like many things, was an eye-opening experience for me and many others. And it kind of showed me that everyone was focused on protest and democracy, but I was more interested to understand how come we still have little knowledge of the role of religion in democratic culture. So I wanted to understand from within the traditional theories of Islam, how should we approach the question of Islam and democracy? And particularly, I wanted to focus on justice as the essential principle of Islam, because we hear a lot about justice in discussions about Islam, but I've never seen a very detailed account of how, as a principal value of Islam, justice relates to democracy. So in a nutshell, I would say that we do not know why democracy is not present in the Muslim world from a cultural perspective. And we also don't know the foundational relationship between religious principles and democratic thinking. So this is basically why I wrote this book. Without going into much detail, I would like to share this slide, which shows the state of the literature. For a long time, the literature on Islam and democracy was dominated by what we call as the essentialist theorizing. Scholars like Eli Keduri, Bernard Lewis, and Samuel Huntington, they argued that Islam and democracy do not go together because Islam leaves no room for man-made legislation, or there is something wrong inherently in the Islamic culture that democracy is not possible for this religion or its adherents. So, of course, the reaction was big. There were multiple responses, and I classified them as theoretical counter-essentialism and empirical counter-essentialism. And my study should be located in the last one, the empirical counter-essentialism. But the theoretical counter-essentialism basically proposed that Islamic concepts such as shura, ijtihad, or similar Islamic legal procedures constitute a foundation for democracy. We also have scholars like Abdullah al-Naim and Muhammad Abu al-Fadl, who argued that it's basically the values like mercy or like justice that matter most for democracy. But overall, existing studies fail to satisfy our intellectual curiosity they were either biased, as in the essentialist theorizing, or they lacked the connection to the empirical social scientific research, as in the counter-essentialist studies. When we look at the empirical studies, they also do not present a cohesive answer to that important question. So here, let me start to talk about the book. Given this literature, I felt like we still needed to do something about Islam and democracy, particularly focusing on the values dimension, looking at justice, and see from a traditional perspective, we can discover a foundation for Islamic thinking in democracy or democratic institutions. So the book basically relies on certain assumptions. So let me talk about those a little bit. Any religion's capacity to inform political preferences stem from values that are essential to a faith. So, and because it's the people who are believing in that faith, it is important that we understand how they understand or practice religion to explain their political choices. Another important assumption here is that we will get nowhere if we are just looking at Islam as a general concept. We should be looking at Muslims as agents of democracy or democratization if you want to link religious values to democratic ideals. And in fact, when we talk about liberal democracy, or we add another adjective to democracy, we are also referring to the attitudes, beliefs of people, or their behavior. So why is it that we say Islam and democracy when we are talking about democracy in the Muslim world and not Muslims and democracy, which should be the main focus of our inquiry? And of course here, I also should say that justice looks like the perfect value because it has multiple connections to the way that people understand and practice their religion of Islam. So more on this, and I will be unpacking this in a minute. I don't think that you need much justification to show that Islam is the essential concept of Islam's ethical political system. It has different meanings and shapes ideas and behavior of an average believer. But most of the time, my experience is that although it has been extremely important throughout the Islamic history, usually systemic studies about its meaning are lacking. And hopefully, the book also makes a contribution by looking at the systematic study of Islam as a religious value that could be foundational to democracy. I was told that the book really provides a very nice account of the journey of justice in Islam, and I hope this is what is coming out of the book when people are reading it. So in one picture, I want to talk about the main argument, the main theory, and the hypotheses that are looked upon in the book. So I start with two assumptions, which is that historical legacies of Islamic justice conceptions inform political preferences. And second, these legacies develop along political and social justice trajectories and continue to shape Muslim political attitudes. So in one sense, I am taking the longer term view, looking at, over time, historically, how justice came to be defined by Muslims and how it shaped their political thinking. So starting with the idea that we can talk of political and social justice, I provide an account of historical trajectory of these two justice conceptions. First of all, I look at the early prophetic community and look at the first fitna, first communal division, and how this has informed people's understanding of the world, or the Muslims' understanding of the world. Here, providing an account of the 7th century conflict between Ali and Muawiyah. I look at how this first division gave way to the separation of different groups in the Muslim community, which was political at first, but later on turned to be a doctrinal and philosophical difference. So in the book, you will see some discussion of how Kharijites were important political thinkers, how Mu'tazila came to be occupying an important space in Muslim political theory, and so on and so forth. But then there's also a second moment, which I also think is very important. And the second moment is the critical juncture of the Mongol invasion of the Muslim world. This has also had lasting consequences on Muslims' worldviews and how they perceive politics and how they practice politics. And here, basically, I was more concerned about how the welfare of the Muslim society was the most important goal. Overall, then, the first fitna gave way to political divisions, creating two different worldviews, one free will and the other predestination. And the Mongol invasion brought the social welfare understanding of Islamic justice to forefront. Here, the public interest or welfare of the society became the most important things. In the book, I argue that these critical events led to the distinct trajectories of justice. And the vision has grown bigger and bigger over time, also encompassing not only doctrinal, but also political, social, and other sorts of divisions. But then the book does try to do something more ambitious. It looks at these trajectories and their development from the prophetic community to the medieval classical Islamic age to 19th century constitutionalism, and all the way to the modernist Islamism and contemporary Muslim preferences. Along the ways, the book makes references to Kharijis, the Mu'tazila, to Islah wa Tajdid movement, to modernist Islamist constitutionalists. It looks at the individualist thinking in Islam, but also bring it to today to talk about the Arab Spring. In all of these attempts, I want to trace the continuities and divergences in Muslim theory and practice, putting the question of Islam and democracy to the center. So this is basically the table showing what I try to do in the book. And again, the distinctive feature of the book is to provide empirical research and bring these discussions into the social scientific circles. In the chapter 3, I do a close reading of Kutub and Shariati, their political writings, and I look at how modernist Islam used political theology to justify political ideas. I also provide a comparative account of Qutb's and Shariati's thoughts to the other Islamists such as Ghanouchi, Mawdudi, Saidi Nursi, and so on. Then I also have a discourse analysis of the Islamist periodicals published in Turkey. I looked at the archives of Turkish Islamist journals from 1960 to 2010. Here I unpack freedom and order as the two elements of Islamist justice conceptions. I do have an ethnographic study, which is based on the in-depth interviews with Turkish Islamists. Some scholars call them the new Islamism. These are generally young people who have a different perception of Islam than the political or traditional Islamists. My ethnographic research, the participant observation, as well as the in-depth interviews, looked at how contemporary Islamist youth construct these ideas of freedom and order, how they define justice and whether they refer to the historical trajectories or not. I also explore their perceptions of politics, mainly focusing on what they think about democracy. The book also presents statistical analysis looking at the world value surveys and the Arab barometer. Here, I develop a theory of individualism, collectivism in relation to democracy. And usually, generally, I find that religion increased support for democracy through individualism and Islam's egalitarian focus on social life. I also look at the Arab Spring and see whether how people understand justice influence their democratic behavior, for which the answer is affirmative. So let me talk about some findings. So I find that the justice conceptions are the leading cultural determinants of democracy in Islam, because justice is the most significant notion in Islam's ethico-political system. This relation is most visible in Muslim political experience. Furthermore, I also find that the legacies of Islamic justice and gender rival legitimacy claims, and these are the gender, I'm sorry, let me take this from the beginning. The legacies of Islamic justice and gender rival legitimacy claims about governance through two distinct paths: discourses of order and discourses of freedom. Now, if you remember my first figure, which was showing the long-term development of justice and its influence on political choices, this figure here is building on a similar idea. And here, I look at notions like Khalifa, which takes us to a man's free will and responsibility, and man's duty to correct the injustices in political sphere, from Kharijis to Mu'tazila to modernists of the 19th century, and all the way to the contemporary Islamism. I find this trajectory of man's vicegerent status, which facilitates a movement toward democratic ideas or democratic thinking. This is what I call the discourses of freedom. On the other hand, we have the notion of qadar, or the predetermination, and interpreting Islam along the predeterministic fashion leads toward a path of obedience, quietism, and authoritarianism. I also put a third concept here to the center, which is the Islamic notion of ihsan. And I argue that ihsan is like a double-edged sword, which can either engender democratic ideas, or it could take you to an authoritarian path due to the primacy of welfare policies in Muslim societies. So then next, the question becomes, can we apply a justice-oriented democratic idea to Turkish Islamism? So here, where the evidence comes in to see whether this rival legitimacy claims are indeed applicable to the real life politics. In order to, confirm the validity of the hypotheses, we should find evidence confirming that Muslims understand justice in specific ways, whether they infer freedom or the idea of order from it or not, is an empirical question to be settled. And we also need to show that individuals, if they make use of Islamic justice conception to derive freedom and order-oriented discourses, whether they link these understandings to their political choices. And I find that, the definition of Islamism in the Turkish context indeed incorporates conception of justice in its ideology. And furthermore, these definitions inspire various political choices. So the two definitions I put here are by Ismail Kara and Ali Bulach, and they define Islamism in a very broad sense. And they also think of it as a solution to the ills of humanity. These broad definitions, though, do not provide the evidence, but they just tell us that there is something in the Turkish Islamism that would allow us to find evidence confirming the many linkages between justice conceptions and democracy. So to that end, I looked at the history of Turkish Islamism from early origins to the current times. I'm not going to go in detail, but there is a historical account of how Islamism went dormant in the early Republican period, but how it reflourished and reemerged in 1960s onward. Particularly 1960, from 1960 to 1980 is an interesting period where we have seen the renaissance of Islamist publishing. Particularly Islamist magazines or periodicals were many. We could count them in hundreds, and this is especially the period that I'm looking at to do my archival research. So for finding evidence about the rival legitimacy claims emanating from justice, I looked at İLEM's IDP in Turkish İslamcı Dergiler Projesi, and I selected certain Islamist periodicals from 1960 to all the way to 2010. I had a research assistant who read the entries in those periodicals with me. And we had a very rigorous filtering method to identify the articles that were about justice. Now, of course, this is no easy task, because if you do a computerized keyword search, there will be thousands of entries when you enter the search term justice. So we need to really do close reading and filter out the articles that were exclusively about the concept of justice. And in the second stage, we also looked for the articles that were making connections to the political choices. So looking at some of the numbers presented in this table, you will see that the number of articles analyzed in chapter 5 are rather low. And that's because this is multi-stage filtering, where we wanted to make sure that we are exclusively looking at those articles that were on justice, but they also make the connection to the political choices. Overall, the archival research was valuable. It first of all gave us a semantic sort of field of Islamic justice conceptions among the Turkish Islamism. Here, some words that were highlighted were zulm, hak, tawhid, and order in Turkish nizam and düzen. Pages after pages, we have seen that these terms were consistently used to construct conceptions of justice. And the slide also includes some quotes from some of these Islamist periodicals. So what's coming out of this archival research is this. We can separate the period from 1960 to 2000 into two broad groups. From 1960 to 1980, maslaha and fitna avoidance, these are the notions of order, nizam or düzen, take precedence. Here we see a very quietist, but also order-oriented ideology for the welfare of the Muslim society. But starting 1980 and the 2000, we see that the discourses of freedom and resistance against zulm take precedence over the discourses of order. An anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist position is particularly prominent during this period. So this figure shows what I was trying to do in chapter 5 in regards to the rival legitimacy claims based on justice. So the discourse analysis first looks at the socio-political reality, looking at the developments on the ground between 1960 to 1908, and also from 1908 to 2010. And I also look at the semantic field of Islamist justice discourses and find evidence that rights, oppression, freedom, but also order matters a lot in those periods. So I find that, again, when you look at the genealogy of Islamism, we find that from 1960 to 1980, social justice trajectory is more important, and social order is promoted as a solution to the moral decay that was present in the society. But in 1980, from 1980 to 2010, we look at a different picture here. Anti-imperialism or discourses of freedom are more important, and we see more coverage of rebellion, being anti-capitalist, or articles that have an anti-American thought more frequently in the journal or the periodicals pages. So let's move on. Next, I also had some ethnographic research, including participant observation and in-depth interviews. And here, let me start with the main contribution and findings. First of all, I find that Islamic conceptions of justice inform political choices among the Islamist youth. But Islamist youth, differently from the Islamist periodicals, they use a rich repertoire of religious values to define justice and make this conception compatible with the spirit of our times. So for them, it is really important that their reconstruction of justice makes sense to understand the current day issues. Just as in the pages of the Islamist periodicals, we also find zulm and haq to be two prominent dimensions of Islamic justice conception, but they also introduced the just testimony principle, in Turkish adil şahitlik, as an important element of justice. I also find that not only the Islamist youth construct Islamic justice conceptions in a modern sense, but they also link those to their political choices. Though I find that their use of notions like zulm and haq and their owning of the discourses of freedom does not necessarily create a pro-democratic attitude. Rather, we find a very cautious approach among this youth toward democracy. They desire democracy, but they think that you need to be careful in its implementation. And here it looks like political justice takes precedence over the democratic ideal. So the participant observation basically involves looking at different religious communities in Turkey. So this picture is telling, on the left, you are seeing what we call as the earth tables, or yeryüzü sofraları in Turkish. Here we are looking at a group of devoted youth, the Islamist youth, doing like iftar, organizing iftar dinners in a very, very humble way. And I've been like in some of this iftar dinners, it is very humble. You don't have any luxury, no tables. It's just like, you sit on the floor, but also like the menu is very simple. On the right, you see an iftar dinner organized by the president's office. Here you see luxury and a lavish style of iftar. So both groups, both communities, they talk about justice, but they meant different things, obviously. Looking at the way that they practice the iftar dinners is quite different. So what do Islamists mean when they talk justice? Well, the question. Here, once again, let me introduce one of my figures, which again presents this dual sort of structure, which was present throughout the book. Again, starting from the first fitna, we started divergences in the Muslim community. Majid Kaduri gave a masterful account of how the two notions, based on the notions of Khalifa and Qadar, introduced freedom-oriented discourses versus order-oriented discourses. Later on, we have seen the work of Hodgson and El-Effendi, which also pointed to a similar duality. And they looked at this distinction between the groups that cherish moral values, dignity, piety, and El-Effendi called this the Medina model, versus the group that cherished the realist politics, but also cherished benevolent absolutism. El-Effendi called this the Damascus model. We have also seen the application of this by the prominent journalist Akif Emre. He made a distinction between Islamism to highlight the ethical focus of the Islamic communities, but also he separated this from Muslimism, which we today describe as political Islamism. So my interviews show that this distinction between Islamism and Muslimism is real. And in fact, it builds on this notion of freedom versus order. So here is a list of the in-depth interviews that I conducted with the religious youth in Istanbul. And here, the interviews lasted between 1 to 3 hours. And these groups were very helpful and very open. And I spent hours and hours with them, also engaging in their events to get the fuller picture. So if you look at the table, you will see that I tried to be as representative as possible. In addition to the Islamist youth, there are also some youth who are not member of any of the Islamist organizations, but who have a devout worldview. So once again, the ethnographic research confirms the long-term influence of Islamic conceptions of justice. It also shows how flexible these conceptions can be to address the problems of our times. Once again, we see that the notions based on Khalifa, man being the vicegerent of God, lead to discourses of freedom and encourage responsibility against injustices. Whereas the notion of Qadar or predetermination takes us to a path of quietism, obedience, and the discourses of order. So in terms of ihsan, or the welfare of the society, the interviews revealed that the welfare of the society was an important goal for the Islamist youth. But they all will also believe that ihsan was possible in a democratic system. That is, it is more likely that you could implement the justice principles in a democracy rather than an authoritarian system. Whereas the devout youth who were not member of the Islamist organizations generally favored what I call a benevolent dictator position, which is, as far as the welfare of the community is guaranteed, it doesn't matter whether it's democracy or authoritarianism. And in fact, they prefer an authoritarian leader who would prefer, who would be able to establish the order in the Muslim society. And I want to actually show here some, quotes from my interviews. You will see that the semantic field there's nothing surprising here, as in the pages of the Islamic journals, we see notions like zulm, we see the notion of servitude to God. We also see references to tyranny, among the Islamist youth. But what was new, novel for me in those interviews is that the use of the just testimony based on a verse in the Quran. The Islamist youth, they really valued this concept a lot, and they believe that being just in your testimony was your responsibility as the vicegerent of God. And I'm not going to spend more time about this. I'm just going to show you that, there were also very explicit sort of open political commentary about about justice and Islam in the Turkish concept. We also see a very critical approach among the Turkish Islamists who are criticizing the existing regime and describing it as zulm, as tyranny, or as oppression.
Yes,
And
Tura.
also, someone talking?
Doesn't matter.
Okay, so and let me actually skip those.
Just make sure you sign the 1040. That was the problem last time. It was not signed.
Okay, so there are like quotes like this. Overall, then the conclusion is that from this interviews is that Islamists do construct Islamic conception in a new light, but they revert back to the early ideas of Khalifa and of Ihsan, of predetermination. But they also are very cautiously linking those to their political choices. I also have like more quantitative stuff, and I kind of want to show the model. I don't have time now to talk about those, but let me, and I can answer, go to those quantitative section in the Q&A question and answer section if there are questions. But I want to actually go to the overall, results and what did we learn from this book. First of all, value orientation stemming from justice mediate the effect of religiosity on support for democracy. Individuals holding egalitarian preferences are more supportive of democracy, but there is also mixed evidence about the order-related outcomes. So by and large then, in conclusion, religion informs political preferences by shaping value orientations. Justice is the central concept of Islam, and it informs value orientations and political preferences. Culture matters, but not in the sense that the essentialist theorizing taught us it does. Rather, from a traditional point of view, we see that Islam is the most important value, or it provides the most important values for people to make sense of their political reality. There is significant potential on an optimistic note for democratization in the Muslim world, yet this potential has not been realized. An important question that could be explored in future studies is why liberation discourse, that's the discourses of freedom, failed in the Muslim history, whereas discourses of order and obedience prevail. I hope to write more about this important question, but I will actually stop here and open the floor for questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Sabri, for this beautiful and insightful and informative presentation. Jazakumullah khair. If I may start, Professor Sami, shall we start with the questions?
I guess we need to start with any comments that you may have, and then we can move.
So just few points on your book. I also read your introduction and the conclusion of the book. So I just want to ask a few things. First, I think the central question of your book is not whether Islam and democracy is compatible in itself. I think you go beyond that notion. You sort of try to assert that what kind of democracy religious Muslims want and would accept. So you also try to argue that to what extent Islamic justice values inform support for democracy. So I just wanted to ask you, when you talk about what kind of democracy, do you think there is a need to theorize the idea of democracy that is independent of a epistemological framework? Is there a need when you talk about democracy?
First of all, thank you for the remark. Yes, definitely. The book is not a book about Islam and democracy. The title gives that impression, but it goes beyond that. By providing the historical journey of justice conceptions from a political point of view, but also looking at what kind of democracy would Muslim want, right? It's definitely not the liberal democracy. And it kind of basically a search for understanding what is it that the people on the ground are wanting when they want democracy. So thank you for that clarification. Yeah, I actually did not define democracy, and this was intentional because we can add many adjectives to democracy to define it. I mean, deliberative democracy, liberal democracy, electoral democracy, and you name it. But for me, these are all imposing a certain understanding, which is very Western-centric understanding of democracy. And they do not necessarily, except for liberal democracy, they do not really consider other values' contribution to democracy. So that's why I did not try to, or I did not intentionally define democracy in the book, but I think there is need for that. We need to take a broad approach and dissect, what it means when we say democracy from a non-Western perspective. And for the context of the book, yeah, what do Muslims mean when they say democracy is a valuable question? There has been many studies about this in non-Western context. The work of Schaffer, for example, in this regard is really, really very valuable. But in my research, I discovered that in the global South, we are seeing more and more attempts to define a democracy from the native values perspective in Africa, in Asia, in the Muslim world. So of course, the book can do certain things. I think we need to do that. To answer your question, going back to your question, yeah, we need to do that, but this is not something that I did in that book, but definitely there is need for that.
Yeah, just in case also at the same time, what I was thinking about while reading your book is, in contemporary times, we have two political theological frameworks within the Muslim world. One is Islamists and another is neo-traditionalists. If you may know, for example, Abdul Hakim Murad, people like Hamza Yusuf. So while reading your book, I was wondering, especially the two, as you mentioned, the first fitna, and you talk about these two parallel narratives which emerge. So can we say, if I may use Carl Schmitt, that two parallel political theologies came into existence, and the whole literature that emerged after this event of fitna, supported one of these two political theologies or these two political theological constructs. In your opinion, do you think that discussions of order, that is political quietism, which you name as, became a norm, while the discourses of freedom, that is liberation theology, took a backseat? So do you think that the literature which emerged after this event, that much of the literature has been primarily supporting the idea of political quietism, and why there has been very less literature in favor of the discourse of freedom?
Yeah, no, very, very good question. And of course, like this duality, it's like an easy escape. Of course, it's always more complex than kind of having like two sides, but it kind of helps us to see the big picture. And you introduce this, Islamist versus neo-traditionalist streams, and I'm familiar with those, but I don't think that my discussion necessarily overlaps with those, right? It's quite different than. Because when we say Islamist, I want to actually separate them into many different subgroups, or the traditionalist or neo-traditionalists also do that. And neo-traditionalists does not necessarily mean that they are supporting order, or Islamists are not always supporting freedom, right? So although I see the value of acknowledging these two different groups, I don't think that my book necessarily overlaps with those. It's actually producing like a new understanding based on political theology, or the discussion of political theology. So going back to your question, I just want to make sure that I understand what you are getting at with this. So basically, yeah, we had two different theologies evolving historically. That's the case. And the reason that I would say the discourses of freedom did not become dominant is they were not favored by the political authority. So here, I am actually moving outside the discussion of political theology, leaving this comfort zone and thinking about sociopolitical reality. So since the 10th, 11th century, we have seen a consolidated model where the religious authority either worked in tandem or subdued to the political authority to justify the existing political models. I am referring here to the medieval, Islamic medieval era, where the ulama became the agents of the state, most clearly seen in the Seljuk and the Ottoman empires. Before, for example, we have in the Umayyad and the Abbasid periods, we have competing factions of the ulama, vying for attention from the political authority. But this disappeared with the gunpowder empires, particularly with the Ottoman Empire. We had a consolidated model where religion was subdued, religious authority was working in tandem or became the agent of the political authority. And hence, I would say, the discourses of freedom did not prevail. That said, though, throughout the Islamic history, we had many, many rebellions, either for sectarian reasons, either for ideology, or we had the rebellions by the Zendaka in early Islamist period. We had the rural rebellions in the Ottoman Empire. In modern times, we had many, many, uprisings, most recently the Arab uprising. But all of those were somehow repressed. In early ages, it was because of the power of the political authority and its ability to subdue the religious authority. But later on, we also had the colonial power intervening in the Muslim society's affairs. So it is many, many reasons, but overall, I think it never became dominant because there was not enough political support on the ground for this discourse to prevail. If you think about it, it would be really, and forgive me the language, it would be really silly for a ruler to say, hey, we have this idea of freedom, which requires justice, and let's kind of, turn the model toward that and bring democratic or pluralistic thinking. This would undermine their own authority. So I think I'm kind of wandering away from the question, but overall, I think it was not a good strategy for the political authority to allow the discourses of freedom to prevail.
Just one more, I think, and then I would hand over to Professor Sami B, or maybe ask questions from the audience. So when you talk about democracy, you talk about justice, you talk about Islam. I was just wondering that I'm sure you are aware about the work of Hawaii Hallak and his Impossible State. And you are also aware about the project which has been started by Salman Saeed. So I was looking at how they critically look at the idea of democracy, the idea of nation state, the kind of tension which is there when Muslims think within their own framework of the idea of democracy, that what kind of democracy they want, and moving away from that, because justice ultimately is the fruit of a political order. So if we are questioning the very political order, the very foundations of the political order, that is the nation state or liberal democracy, how do you think that we can, while not being under the umbrella of liberal democracy or the umbrella of nation state, do you think there is a possibility where the conception of justice can be conceived in an alternate political order? Is there a possibility for Muslims to think about?
Yeah, that's a good question, and there's really a lot to unpack here. I'm familiar with the Impossible State, but not with the second research that you cited. But oh boy, let me think a second here. There is definitely a tension between the nation-state model and an ummah-oriented thinking. That is obvious, because when we talk with the religious people or with the Islamists, going back to my interviews, they kind of have this idea of ummah, this global Muslim community. Everyone thinks that, yeah, we have ummah, for the sake of ummah, they use these expressions. But I never got the feeling that this had any real standing. It's just like this distant ideal. Let me start with this. So I don't think that it has the the real sort of conditions to become a relevant political idea. So in this sense, we will have to think within the paradigm of nation state. So this is first. So let's start with that. This is my approach, at least. Second, the kind of tensions that we see among the Muslims about what kind of democracy and whether justice can be a foundation for that. I think it relies on the fact that we are talking about two different worldviews which are being confused all the time. Let me explain. So we have, on the one hand, this notion of freedom and democracy, right? I don't think there is a counterpart in Islamic theology for that, although I used it because this was the tool that I had, conceptual tool that I had to talk to the audience who are essentialists, right? But we do have the notion of justice. And in fact, I forgot the name, maybe one of the audience, if they know, one of the Egyptian statesmen, he said that, he went to Europe and his first observation is that what the Europeans mean by freedom, we call it justice here in the Muslim world. So we don't have freedom, but we have justice. Right. So in defining what kind of democracy that Muslims want, we have to recognize that this is our paradigm. We start from there. And justice could be taken to very, very many different places, as my book tries to show. And in fact, I'm glad you asked this question because this is exactly the main idea of the book, that rather than using these Western notions like liberalism or like, freedom and so on and so forth, we should be using justice with all of its implications to construct a political theory. So I said that, it's always been confused because people speak the language of the Western liberal democracy, but in fact, I think what they mean is the language of Islamic justice. And we have, unfortunately, not so many studies that are, dealing with that. We have to really, bring this to fore. And it will be the justice conceptions with all of its meanings that will tell us what kind of political model Islam is proposing or what is feasible within a nation-state model. And, one final thing here to answer that question, and I don't think that I'm doing enough justice to answer your question, but basically I would say that maybe there is a path from the Ummah-oriented thinking, from justice to Ummah-oriented political models. But I don't know what this is, and I have not explored it yet. And maybe someone is going to do a study about this. But in the current juncture, I don't think that we have to work in the nation-state model. But what we can do is we can use Islam's own concepts emanating from justice to construct a political model within the nation-state model.
Thank you so much. Just a question from the audience, and then we might shift to Professor Sami. So as you said, this is the question from Dr. Fadi Zatari. He asks, as you said, justice is central to Islam and Islamic political thought. What can the Islamic experience of Muslims teach us in modern times regarding justice? And more specifically, how the Arab Spring can benefit from such historical knowledge?
Okay, I'm also reading the question now. That's thank you, Dr. Zatari. That's a really good question. So I think they can learn a lot in the sense that the Islamic experience is full of examples about how the tension between order and freedom throughout Islamic history unravels. And we have all these ideas. We have the philosophy. When I say we, I'm referring to the Muslims that have the material to inform the contemporary problems of the Muslim societies. And my book is only one attempt to bring this to the light, because we have the first fitna, which itself is quite constructive in building the political theory of Islam. We have a rich history spanning from Central Asia to Europe. We have distinct sort of political models, states. We have distinct social movements, and all of this should be helpful for us to construct what justice means and how this informs political models in our times. The Arab Spring, coming to the second part of the question, the Arab Spring, I think it was already benefiting from such historical experience. Think about this like genetic codes that people actually, they born and grow into that culture. And there's no systematic effort to teach that, but from school, from family, from society, you learn this history. It is part of your life. So in one sense, it's like this invisible sort of material that kind of brings these people together. They all understand what justice is, right? Because of their upbringing or because of their experience within these cultures. And Arab Spring, to me, was also being influenced by that. And, in the chapter about the Arab Spring, I say that this is nothing like, unusual, because we had seen this kind of uprisings and rebellions throughout the Islamic history. And the scholars quickly discarded the role of Islam in Arab Spring protests. They said, oh, it's not about religion. It's basically about economic decline. It's about grievances. But I always thought that there was something religious about it, because the main message that was driving this protest was social justice. It was Ashuriya Karama Insaniya, right? It was basically the idea of freedom, the idea of human dignity. And this is what I think Arab Spring was about. And no one, of course, said that this is about this, Islamic history and how people think about justice and about democracy, but they just said that it's about grievances, economic grievances, it's about political grievances. So to, answer Dr. Zaatari's question, yes, Arab Spring already benefited from it. But then as unfortunately, as we have seen in the medieval times, the political authority, once again, I would say, subdued the religious authority. In this case, with fierce repression in case of Egypt, right? And other places like in Tunisia by co-opting them. So it did not work, but the potential is still there. And not only Arab Spring, but the future sort of mass mobilizations will benefit from maybe more clearly using the language of justice. I hope this answers Dr. Zaatari's question. Happy to follow up if she has further comments.
Hopefully. And this will be the last question from our side, inshallah. It is again from Professor Fadi. He's saying that you mentioned the concept of ihsan. In the Quran, Inna Allah ya'muru bil adli wal ihsan. Allah commands justice and doing ihsan, as if justice alone does not work, and that's why ihsan is also needed. Please elaborate more on the concept of ihsan and if you see it connected to modern politics. So how important is the idea of ihsan in modern politics?
Oh, that's a perfect question. In fact, I use the same verse in my in my book. It's like in one of the notes. Yeah, justice itself is not enough, and that's why it always says justice and ihsan. But I think ihsan itself is part of justice. That's how I approach it. I would like to think the justice as like this broad umbrella concept. It has many different facets, and one of the important, sub categories that's filling it is the notion of ihsan. And here, ihsan could mean many things. It could mean freedom too, but in the book, I like to focus on its meaning that's about public interest of the Muslim community or welfare of the Muslim community. So in the book, I defined ihsan as any act or behavior that creates goodness for society, that is compatible with the public interest or with the welfare of the Muslim society. So I take it from this, like, social welfare point of view. And I think because it is such an important concept, it could form the practical foundation of a Muslim democratic experience. Let me try to explain this a little bit. So justice, think about justice as a general concept, as this philosophy or the idea or intellectual foundation of democratic thinking in Islam, a condition that requires freedom, human dignity, and so on, which are also essential to democracy. But just as a liberal democracy is not only about liberal ideology, but it also is about distribution of welfare benefits, ihsan could be foundational for creating an Islamic-based welfare model within an Islamic democratic experience. Okay, so in this sense, ihsan is, I would say, from a practical point of view, this idea of creating distributive conditions that would ensure justice and help the Muslim democratic experience become a reality. Yep, I think I will stop there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Jazakumullah khair. And now I would request Professor Sami, who is the Director of Center for Islamic Global Affairs, to have his observations, his comments, his questions. Jazakumullah khair.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Mehraj, for bringing this very fruitful discussion and conversation to CIGA and to our audience. I also want to thank Dr. Sabri Çiftçi for his presentation, very enlightening, very refreshing, and it did the ethnographic approach also was very intriguing. I do have some points that I'd like to raise, and perhaps you can answer them. I'll try to raise them all together. First, the question of what we mean by democracy. You said you didn't really want to, you didn't want to define it as such, but I think it is central that we define what democracy means, because in people's minds, particularly not just in the West, but also in the Muslim world, it does have a notion of the liberal democracy, particularly among liberal and secular groups. It does entail liberal democracy. So, and there is, of course, there is a contention between some democratic principles, or what is meant by democracy in liberal democracy, and what a Muslim society is supposed to function. That's the point of the impossible state of Wa'il Hallaq. If we wanted to have a Sharia-based society, meaning Sharia as being the epitome or the apex of establishing justice in society according to the Islamic paradigm, that there is a contention between these democratic values and what a Sharia-based society might be. Of course, there has been an attempt among Islamists to try to ameliorate that kind of contention, or try to address it in a modern way. And I wanted to see from your studies, from your readings, and from your conclusions and findings, whether there has been a path. We have seen, of course, the change within the Arab Spring phenomena, particularly in Tunisia, and before that, theoretically speaking, among other Muslim scholars, trying to talk about these concepts and try to make them, quote unquote, Islamize them in a way. But still, we cannot deny the fact that even with that modernist approach, there has always been a contention that there are certain things within the democratic liberal tradition that would be very difficult to reconcile with a Sharia-based society. Whether, and then democracy by itself, it's a concept that was born out of the European experiment, and it's been applied within the nation-state model. And you did mention that you were struggling whether this is going to be applicable to an ummatic type approach. And of course, I think you answered that question, even though I would like to see if there isn't any approach that can actually have this kind of democratic principle within the ummatic approach. I'm not trying to, play down the importance of democracy, but I'm trying to have a definition that would be compatible, if one exists, with the concept that Sharia would be dominant. Of course, the contention or the main problem here is that who is sovereign? Is it man or God? Within a Sharia-based society, God is sovereign. The problem is who interprets God's words. But in a democratic, so-called liberal, secular, Western humanist model, that concept is totally absent, meaning God has no role really in the public affairs of people, and therefore it is the majority of the people who would decide what is or is not acceptable. And of course, on its face, that definition by itself would immediately clash with a Sharia approach or an Islamic, quote unquote, Islamic democratic approach. So the question of which one takes precedence, what would be the higher value here? And if it is within the Islamic context or the Islamic paradigm, we're talking about that in a Muslim society, God will always play a role, Islam will always play a role. In other words, there are certain principles that they cannot be undone by any kind of a human will or so-called democratic approach. Then how we define this? What are the limits by which we can say, okay, within these limits, we can practice democracy? And then does the word democracy then lose its real conceptual understanding, or are we trying to reinvent or invent another one? We're not talking, when many people were talking about majoritarian rules and calling it democracy and try to impose certain notions. And of course, we have a problem. Even in the West, some people use that. I like your approach about the nativist principle. We see that in China today. But again, these are things which are not really well defined. What is democracy, quote unquote, in China? What is democracy, quote unquote, in Iran? What is democracy, quote unquote, in other experiments? And how do we define them? I'm not arguing for liberal democratic structure or liberal democratic universal rule, because that's, of course, is impossible. But if the West has defined its own so-called who's democratic and who's not, I think we really need to come to define our own rather than leave it loose and let the others define who you are. I like the fact that you linked, and this is very important, justice to this discussion, because I think the most important concept within any society is to establish justice, because justice should be the higher value of every society, and everything else stems from it. One thing also I wanted to bring to the discussion, I wanted to hear your opinion, which is the role of imperialist powers. The ones who actually imposed their model on much of the Muslim world for the past couple of centuries. We see also that today the foreign interference never ceased. There's a global and great power politics within the system, and sometimes it's being used and abused, these words. And I think the discussion needs to be broadened to the point where the influence of foreigners, in which they use these concepts to further their interests, that muddies the waters within the same. Certainly, they don't like to see societies, particularly Muslim societies, having real sovereignty or having real independence or having the ability to express the will of the people in a way that they determine that it is antagonistic to their own interests, and therefore they will try to undermine it every step of the way. And we saw this quite clearly within the Arab Spring experiments. They saw that if the people actually express their will and they become real sovereign, even under the notion of a democratic rule, that they will be against it, which shows the hypocrisy of these systems. And therefore, we should not be shy to talk about our model, our paradigm, rather than trying to talk about concepts and paradigms that really do not represent neither the history, nor the belief, nor the interest of society. Another point I'd like to bring into this discussion, the question of change. How do we change Muslim societies? And what is the ultimate goal? Some people think the ultimate goal should be justice. Others, the ultimate goal should be democracy, particularly within liberal and secular groups, and freedom. And of course, what approach do we take? Do we take a revolutionary approach or do we take a reform approach? I would like to hear more from you about your understanding and findings vis-a-vis the Turkish experiment. Certainly, it was not revolutionary. It was more like a reform-based approach versus, for example, the revolutionary path that Iran took, in which they changed this and reoriented the structure and order in society to the point where they're trying to present, whether you agree with them or not, to a model where they try to be both Islamic and democratic, meaning that it has some sort of a public input and public representation within that system. And certainly when you look closely at the checks and balances within that system, again, in the narrow sense of what an Islamic, quote unquote, Islamic democracy is, you'll find that there's a lot of checks and balances within that systems. They never missed an election, and so on and so forth. But of course, certainly it is not a liberal democracy paradigm. And therefore, they created their own paradigm. When we look at Turkey, on the other hand, we also find that it has nothing to do with religion, because religion has been totally, because of the history of the emergence of the Turkish Republic on the ruins or collapse of the Ottoman Caliphate, it is trying to move in a very, very slow manner, but using basically liberal democracy. But at the end of the day, religion really plays very, very small part in politics. It's rather maybe in some public morality, but that's really not telling very much. The other points I would like to raise and also get your opinion on regarding the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, you're right, it was more about social justice and about tyranny and about what you call zulum and the fact that human dignity and you want to change. And it was at a moment of history where these things all coincided together. And of course, the counter-revolutionary forces fought tooth and nail not to have any kind of a democratic or successful experiment within the Arab world, because that would have certainly been copied throughout. So what they created were failed systems, failed states, failed societies in order to exhaust the people, so they would never think about change in that manner at all. And this, of course, was financed and pushed very hard by authoritarian regimes. Now, we've had this, we've been observing this for over a dozen years. What lessons can we learn? Because most of the people, the lesson they got is that democracy, it doesn't work in the Arab world. It doesn't, meaning that we cannot make change through democratic means, that democracy is a joke. And those who advocate democracy, whether internally or externally, they're using it for their own purposes. The real failure of the Arab Spring, they say, is that they never really embarked on a revolutionary approach for change. And revolutionary approaches would rarely end up with democratic experiments. Maybe eventually, after many changes in society, they would opt to have a more representative system. But that is not something that people would jump on. Is that they can create democratic societies of the tyranny. In other words, reform or the Turkish experiment is very difficult to copy. And if we have doubts about this, all what you have to do is just to look at Tunisia as an example, because the Tunisian Islamists, they really did everything possible and more in order to allow that experiment to succeed. They gave up every notion of what other people thought that they were sacrosanct or red lines, and yet look what the situation is today. So again, the question here is, when we talk about democracy and we talk about Muslim societies, and I'm talking about theoretically now, I'm talking about practically on the ground, and we're talking about change. Is a democratic approach possible? Everywhere you go in the Muslim world, you will find that these are being manipulated. Look at Pakistan and Imran Khan. Look at Bangladesh. Yes, you have some elections and you have some, but mostly these are being manipulated and to put also religion under the thumb with the not even tacit support, with the open support of great powers. So my final comment, and I would like also to hear you comment about, if you have time with all these points, is where do you see, after researching, writing, looking, interviewing people, where do you think the best approach is? Is it trying to come up with a paradigm where people can follow, and is the Turkish model really the model for people to emulate and follow, in the hope that perhaps after maybe a long period of time, you can reconcile what most believers think, that there are certain injunctions in religion, in Sharia, that need to be adopted in public life? Or is it really more of a revolutionary approach in which democracy itself would be sacrificed and maybe gained later by redefining what democracy or Islamic democracy might be in a Muslim society? Let me stop here and hear your comments. Thank you very much again for your presentation.
Oh, thank you so much. Oh, wow. There's quite a bit to unpack here, but I will actually maybe touch base to some of those for the sake of time. But I want to say that they're really, really excellent points. The definition question, yes, it keeps coming back, haunting me. Yes, we need to provide a definition eventually, right? And I kind of talk a little bit about it in the book. I was looking at those pages while you were, commenting about this approach that presents democracy as the end outcome of modernization, scientific revolution, technological innovation, industrialization. To me, this is the starting point of many definitions, right? So I'm not going to provide a definition now, but I feel like any definition should include values like dignity, a woman's worth as a special creature of God. So this should be the starting point. And I think a lot of the democratic backsliding we see today, even in the Western world, is because of the erosion of the value of human. The deterioration of the human dignity. So this should be our starting point. It is true that we also need objective socioeconomic conditions for democracy to work. But if we have this idea of human dignity, I think this is a good starting point. And we know that, and at least in the book, I try to make this an important point, is that justice, Islamic justice, requires human dignity. And this is what the Arab Spring was basically about. coming to this tension between Sharia and democracy, and I want to actually, your last point about the Turkey becoming a model, I think it's relevant here. For me, Turkish model is an example where we link Sharia from Islam. This may come as something strange and maybe not possible for some, but the Turkish experience for me is a story where Islam was kept relevant in social and political life without Sharia. So the public opinion surveys also show that the devout people in Turkey do not necessarily take Sharia as the most important, aspect of their religion. Now, a lot of the tension comes about like the Sharia implementation is because some, Sharia is obviously God's word. If we implement it, then there's little room left for man-made legislation, so democracy does not become a possibility. But this tension, I think, is not necessarily the end of the road. Because as Turkish experience showed, if you could do two things. Number one, you could delink Sharia from religion and present religion with its ethical core, rather than legal aspects or rule-based aspects. Number two, you claim that some scholars do that you can interpret Sharia in a flexible way. It's subject to change, and this is the approach of Abdullahi Ahmed al-Naim and Muhammad Abu al-Fadl, Khalid Abu al-Fadl. So this is the second approach. But for me, the Turkish experience is more realistic, where you delink Sharia from religion and present the religion's ethical core. And of course, this is not something that I discussed in the book, but it is hopefully the wisdom, if I gained any, the wisdom that I gained doing all that research. Also taking time here, trying to cover as many as I can. You're right. Reform is very difficult to copy. Tunisia was, a very, very, frustrating to watch. And reform was not always possible. But and people have like different explanations for this. But for the purpose of today's discussion, I would say that we should be fair to Islam with its ethical or justice values. This was never part of the debate, right? I mean, it was basically, what people discussed was Islamist parties, political Islam, whether this party is going to moderate, become secular or not. I did not see a discussion about the core ethical values of Islam, about what justice means and what this could be foundation. No one did that. So we should be fair. I mean, it was not part of the discussion. So it's hard for me to tell what will happen if this really is pursued, this agenda is pursued. A paradigm can be, I think, established here. A paradigm that's based on the native values, the Islamic values. Now, in the West, when we look at the adventure of democracy, we will see that it is a result of many centuries development of change, economic conditions. But it all started with an idea, right? It all started with an idea. So the rest will follow, I think. And I'm not kind of being like very essentialist here, not taking a position that, implement the ideas and you're going to get democracy. But unless we are thinking about this idea, we cannot bring about the objective change that is necessary out there. Let me see. The role of imperialist powers was another point that you highlighted. So here we should avoid taking the easy path, right? we can blame the imperial powers for all the ills that we have, right? We can say it's the colonialism, it's the foreign intervention. But we are the societies that give the opportunity to interfere to the imperial powers. So something's wrong at the core from within the Muslim societies. We need to, talk about, I think, imperialism as an impediment to democracy, which I talk in the conclusion of the book. And one reason that the discourses of freedom did not prevail in the modern times is the imperialist intervention. But before imperialism, we didn't have democracy either, and we didn't have the conditions, to do that. So it's just basically maybe a contributing factor, but it's not the cause, I would say. Though that said, we still need to acknowledge it, right? The big, foreign interference is important, but this limits our thinking. If we're just kind of thinking within that mode, saying that it's the imperialist thinking, we cannot see the full picture, or we cannot see the objective conditions that are making democracy an impossibility in Muslim majority societies. I don't think I was able even to address a fraction of things, but is there anything else that you would like me to highlight here? I'm also looking at the time. It's 9 o'clock here. I think 5 o'clock there.
Yeah, well, I thank you. Thank you very much for your responses. I just wanted to elaborate more about, do you see, again, from the discussion on the impossible state, from your admiration of the Turkish model, do you see any path towards real compatibility in terms of democratic notions and Sharia-based society? Because many Muslims, regardless of what's happening in Turkey, they still think that they cannot fulfill their religious obligation without having I wouldn't call it the traditional model, because that's gone. But the fact that Sharia does have a role to play, not selectively, but as the principle, yet they don't want to be dominated by simply religious interpretation. They want also the layman to be part of that discussion, but not to undermine Sharia or Sharia understanding, or let's say the purpose of Sharia, but to be within that paradigm. The question is, from your perspective, from your research, from your readings, from your knowledge, the impossible state of Wa'il Hallaq basically states this in a very simple way. To import the traditional model to modern state system is impossible. So that was his conclusion. So the answer is not trying to argue, no, it is compatible, because I think that discussion is, for the large part, is gone. The question is, can we change what a current society is? Because you talk about citizenship today, in the modern state system, you're not talking about millet system. So things have changed. Now, going back to the Ummatic approach, is there any way by which, and this of course needs a lot of political science and also many other disciplines to come together, is there a path towards redefining modern societies in a way that it can combine both the gains that people think they have because of the modern system, and also to preserve a notion that Sharia still plays a role in organizing their life? Do you see that that possibility in the future? Is that gone? As Jamil Aydin said, for instance, in his book The Muslim World, he thinks this is all fantasy about this Muslim Ummah. It's never been a Muslim Ummah. Versus, for instance, Al-Faruqi with this Ummatic approach.
So yeah, I think this is also kind of goes to the heart of this big problem, the puzzle that we are discussing here. First of all, I don't think that it's a fantasy, because it's real. Maybe in Turkey, Sharia is not the top, sort of agenda item for the Muslims or the seculars who identify as Muslim. But for most of for rest of the Muslim world, yes, it is still very important. In fact, Sharia is almost equal to Islam in the minds of many and many devout individuals. So it's not a fantasy. Neither Ummah is a fantasy. And I think the affinity, the sympathy that people have toward each other, even though they live in nation states, is real. And I expect, and you were here in the States too, in the United States too, Dr. Islami, and I'm here now. When I go to the local masjid, we all forget where we are from, right? And the sympathy, the sincerity is real. It is not, it's just not like a political project, but it is real. Like, you know, the people are experiencing it every day. We all feel that we're part of Ummah. So neither Sharia nor Ummah are fantasies. But I have more to say about Sharia. First of all, you were talking about reform. I think real reform is not political reform. It is religious reform. And a good part of this is about reforming what we understand from Sharia. It is basically, if you take the traditional version, I would say it is strict. It is resistant to change, and it does not necessarily address today's problems. But this is not how Sharia came into being. It was dynamically evolving from the early period of Islam. It was changing until a certain period in time in history. It was changing, it was flexible, but we stopped doing that. Some people put the blame on Al-Ghazali, but I think he's not the only guy who is responsible for that, static condition. But we stopped at some point renewing it. In 19th century Ottoman Empire, in 19th century Tunisia, we had attempts for, recreating it, rechanging it, and so on. But this failed. So then the answer is, I think there is really big overlap conceptually and philosophically between ideals of democracy and ideals of Sharia. They both concern human dignity. They both concern social justice. They both concern, I would say, development of women, cherishing of man as the special creature of God. Well, special creature for the Islam part, but for the liberal democracy part, it will be the special, citizen status. So they are actually, I think, talking about the same sort of, ideas, same concepts, but this potential is not realized. There are attempts to reform Sharia, but they are meeting with big time resistance from the traditional circles. So I would say then, without necessarily being too speculative here, yes, Sharia is basically the essence of justice, and argue that justice is the essence of democracy. But what's Sharia? Which Sharia is a different question, right? So unless we reform Sharia in a flexible way, which Abdullah Ahmed al-Naim does, Muhammad Khalid Abu al-Fadl does, they come from a traditional perspective, but they also introduce this flexible, more adaptive sort of interpretation of Sharia. Unless we do that, we have no other option than the linking Sharia from Islam. Now, in different parts of the Muslim world, I would say that part of the tensions we see between Islam and politics is because they could not link Sharia from Islam, neither they were able to interpret Sharia in a flexible manner. If you ask me personally, I would prefer a flexible interpretation to the linking, though objective conditions might unfold differently in places like Turkey, Tunisia, or Indonesia. They may follow the path of the linking rather than flexible interpretation. Some parts will not be able to do the flexible interpretation, but Muslim world is a large geography. So we may see the flexible interpretation possible. To conclude, yes, I think we should not think them as fantasy, but Islam and Sharia are compatible, but this will depend on how we define democracy and how we define Sharia at the same time.
Thank you very much. And I think it's interesting that towards the end, you try to come up with a definition. I think it's a working definition of how we can look at both concepts and what bring them together. And I think that's a good start. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Again, thank you. I appreciate for the invitation. I'll let, maybe Mehraj do the conclusion. I can, specify the thanks then.
Honestly, I have 3 more questions after this conversation, but I will let them be for the, inshallah, next conversation with you, inshallah, hopefully with your next book. So thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and hopefully we're going to invite you soon again, maybe in Istanbul in person for a new lecture on a new book, inshallah. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of our viewers for being with us, listening to this beautiful, wonderful lecture. Jazakumullah khair. And this is all from Dr. Mehraj. I work as a research fellow with Center for Islamic Global Affairs.